The reduction in sexual transmission is still quite challenging. I think in terms of preventing transmission through male-male sex, we're still stuck in Western paradigms. The whole MSM movement is still very much dominated by the presumption that men who have sex with men are actually really gay, that they're closeted. Only we can liberate them and stuff, which is not at all what we find in our studies. So I think just more focusing on the behaviour rather than these paradigm wars that go on in the AIDS world. And of course, if a vaccine or a microbicide comes along, that will help enormously, though I think we all know that won't happen in the next decade.
Thanks. Some more questions there must be.
A few years ago, David Ho from the Aaron Diamond Foundation gave the Burnet oration, and I remember walking away from his talk thinking that the prevalence of HIV in China is increasing exponentially, and also earlier this year, Kevin Ducott from WHO commented about, kind of implied that the HIV epidemic in Africa is more or less under control, whereas we're seeing more of a problem in the Asia region. I was wondering whether you could comment about whether there's a difference between the prevalence of HIV in China versus the statistics you've given in your talk, as well as difference in terms of modes of transmission.
Well, there have been paradigm wars in the response to HIV, and there have been epidemiology wars too. And I think finally that we're getting to a point where there is some agreement that these alarmist predictions about, for example, China, about India, were not correct. They were not based on any evidence. The prevalence in China and the prevalence in India is probably much lower than it was thought to be only 3 years ago. In India, there are only 2 states where even the prevalence reaches 1%. And the overall national prevalence is probably around 0.5%. So much, much lower than what was predicted. If you take the time, you'll see there's been some quite unpleasant exchanges on the epidemiology of HIV in Asia. And James Chin has been one person, a very respected epidemiologist, who's always challenged these statements that China is heading for a massive generalized epidemic. India is, it hasn't happened. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't worry. This graph, which is based on what is now meant to be probably the best epidemic model for use in Asia, developed at the East-West Centre in Hawaii. And it shows that HIV infections reached a peak in the mid-1990s. And due to some successes, particularly in the blue bar, okay, the blue bars were the biggest ones, men buying sex. The overall rate of new infections declined. But they now project that due to some failures, and the 2 big failures are in addressing injecting drug use, and the risk involved with injecting drug use, and sex between men, that there will be now an increase. There's nothing like, if you look at the prevalence in the general population can't get much higher than 3 or 4 or 5%. While this is the way in which HIV is transmitted. Africa, I think it's too early to say it's peaked and it's declined. It's certainly declined in some countries. The difficulty in interpreting the data is that prevalence is now estimated in a different way than it used to be. It used to be based on prevalence in antenatal clinics. Over the last few years, a number of national representative population surveys have been done. And in every country, the prevalence that those surveys found is a lot lower than the prevalence among antenatal clinics. because those anti-neighbour clinics that were part of the Sentinel surveillance systems were probably usually in urban areas. So it's hard to know whether the recent decline in prevalence is real, so it's a decline in incidence, or it's due to different estimation methods. But Ethiopia, Rwanda, Kenya, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Botswana are all examples of countries where there's good evidence, and Uganda, where there's been a real decline in incidence in new infections. The big disappointment, of course, is South Africa, which has the largest number of infected people in the world. And there's very little evidence that incidence is declining in South Africa. So certainly the alarmist reports about China were not well founded.
So do you think that Asia is being neglected and there's more emphasis being put on Africa in terms of...
You could argue that there aren't enough resources in any part of the world. I wouldn't like to play one continent off another. You can see from this graph the potential for an escalation, a significant escalation by 2020. So I wouldn't want to say take the resources away from Africa and put them here or vice versa. It's just we need to find adequate resources for everywhere.
Thank you. Really enjoyed your talk.
Yes.
Given your links with the military and the police forces in countries like Laos, have you instituted any programs in correctional facilities, given that in those facilities you see a large population of these at-risk behaviours and people...
Correctional, did you say?
Correctional facilities, that sort of thing.
I think Indonesia's the only place where we've really sort of been able to break through that barrier. Correctional facilities are very sensitive places. I don't even think condoms are available in Victorian prisons yet. I think they are in Queensland, maybe one or two other states. So they're very sensitive areas. But even to a relatively small scale in Indonesia, we've been able to support programs that distribute bleach to sterilise needles and condoms, still on a pretty small scale. Just the very idea to the Department of Corrections of making condoms available is acknowledging that there is this behaviour going on that they don't want to acknowledge, even though there's a ton of data. There was a recent survey from Rio de Janeiro where 75% of prisoners on discharge reported having had sex while they were in prison. We all know that happens. So only in Indonesia have we broken through, I think. Is anyone anywhere else? Central Asia.
Thanks. So if there are no more questions, we'll draw this to a close. Like it had nothing to do with the fact that you're a Collingwood supporter, that you're awarded this, although it did work out well as far as I was concerned, and all future winners of this award will need to switch their allegiance now if you to get up there. Really, it was wonderful to hear that, and it does, as I said before, reflect our Institute's commitment to a broad spectrum approach to health problems that we think are incredibly significant to the world and that can make the most impact. And thank you once again for presenting, going so much trouble and giving such a wonderful oration today. Ladies and gentlemen, the 2008 Fenner Lecturer, Toole. To come upstairs in the tower in the hand room to enjoy refreshments and to chat to Mike and probe him even tougher with some data. Thank you all for coming.